see. And I said the topic of becoming. And she looked a little askance and she said, well, speak slowly. And you may need some tension tamer after the talk. So, the word becoming, the Pali word is bhava, is a very important word in the Buddha's teachings. He defines the cause of suffering in terms of bhava. He defines suffering itself often in terms of bhava. And yet he doesn't ever define it, what he means. The only way you can find a definition is looking at how he uses it in the text, in different contexts. But I think a good way for us to get a grasp of the concept is to reflect on the fact that even though we all live in the same world, we live in different worlds. And it's the same world and the different worlds are also both aspects of bhava, or becoming. For instance, suppose you were looking at a mountain and you had training as a geologist, as a miner, as a skier, and as a photographer. Now, depending on what you wanted out of the mountain, you would see a different mountain, and you would be a different person. If you wanted to get wealth out of the mountain, you'd put aside your photographer and you'd be the miner. If you wanted to get adventure out of the mountain, you would be the skier. And again, each case you would see the different mountain. You would notice the striations in the rock in a different way. If there was snow or there's no snow, that would have different meanings for you. And this sense of what you want out of something, based on your experience around things like that, and also the sense of identity that inhabits that, all that is becoming. So you've got your sense of identity in a certain world of experience based around a desire, based around a sense of clinging. The Buddhist word bhava is sometimes translated as becoming, sometimes as existence, or sometimes as being. I tend to prefer the translation becoming because it is something that follows on doing. We're not talking about a metaphysical absolute. It's something that the mind creates, and there's a continual process going on here. The Buddha says there are basically 3 levels of bhava. The first level is based on sensual desire. You inhabit the world of your senses because you want something out of the senses. You want nice sounds, nice smells, nice tastes, nice tactile sensations, and so on. That's one level, is the sensual level of becoming. A second level of becoming is the level of form. You might want to try an experiment. Close your eyes right now and think about your body as you're experiencing it from the inside. As you experience it, okay, you can't tell what color it is, you can't tell what you look like, whether you're old, whether you're young. There's just a shape of the body that you're inhabiting. If you try to fully inhabit the body, your arms, your legs, be aware of the entire body, that's called a bhava, or level of becoming, of form, because it's the shape of the body as experienced from within. And it can be painful or it can be relatively pleasant. In fact, one of the practices of meditation is to make this experience pleasant. A third level of bhava is the formless one. Now suppose your breath were to stop while you're sitting here with your eyes closed. And not stop because you're dying, but simply stop because the mind comes to a great sense of peace and calm. After a while, the sense of the surface of your body as defined by the shape of the body would begin to dissolve, because there was no motion inside to create that sense. And you would have a sensation of kind of little dots of feeling, dots of sensation filling the body. And then you might realize, okay, there's space between the dots, and you could go with the space, and you realize there was no end to the space. That would be a formless state of becoming. Just focus on the sense of space, sort of permeating your body and extending out in all directions. What's interesting about the human condition is that we go through these levels relatively quickly. You can have a sensual desire, and then you decide, I don't want to bother with that desire, you let it go, or you're sitting in meditation, get back in touch with your breath. There you are with a level of form. And if you really develop this, you can get it to a formless level. This process of becoming, or these 3 levels, have both psychological and cosmological dimensions. This is one of the distinctive parts about the Buddha's teaching, is that the process, he says, by which we create these worlds as we go through the day, is the same process that when, after you pass away, you go to another level of being. It's the same sort of thing. There's a desire, and then there's a sense of identity built around the desire, and then a world that you inhabit based around that desire as well. Now, whether you accept the Buddha's teaching on rebirth or not, he says the important thing is that you learn how to master the process here in the present moment. Now, for many of us, we can be interested in the topic of bhava, or becoming, because of the light that it shows on, say, how you create a fictional world. If you're a writer trying to create a world of fiction, you have to fully inhabit that world of your imagination. If you're, say, a mathematician working on a more formless level, again, you have to fully inhabit those the forms of the math, or the formless and more abstract parts of the math. It's also interesting to think about your dreams in terms of bhava. If you ever watch yourself fall asleep, you realize there's a point where you lose sense of your outside surroundings, and an image of another world appears in your mind, and you go zip right into the image. And that's when you've fallen asleep and started your first dream. However, from the Buddha's point of view, he's more interested in the relationship of becoming to the problem of why there is stress and suffering, and how you can put an end to stress and suffering. So that's where the focus of his discussion is. And he noted that the process that creates becoming is also the same process that creates suffering. So that these imaginary worlds, as we create them, or these worlds of experience as we create them, we're creating stress, we're creating suffering. Now, the level of stress may be so refined that you wouldn't really want to call it suffering. I had a friend in Bangkok, an American journalist, and he said, "You Buddhist guys, why are you always talking about suffering? I don't have any suffering in my life. This isn't relevant to me." And I said, "Do you have any stress in your life?" He said, "Oh yeah, all the time." There you are. Okay. So when you talk about stress, I prefer to talk about stress myself, because suffering is too sort of dramatic and romantic. When you talk about your suffering, you really like to cling to your suffering, because it feels nice to have a good, juicy suffering. It's like Rachmaninoff. But if it's just stress, there's nothing romantic about it. Okay, so think of it. The process of creating these worlds is stressful. We think of fictional worlds as having kind of a nice beginning and a nice end, which is one of the reasons why we like fiction. The world is not like that. We create these states of becoming, and then they just tend to kind of peter out or unravel, or we get bored with them and move on to another one. And it's this process of constant unraveling, or the fact that if you want to keep a state of becoming going, you have to keep looking after it and tending to it. There's a fair amount of stress that goes into that process. And so, from the Buddhist point of view, it's important that we understand this process, so ultimately that we can put an end to it. He tells a story that illustrates the way becoming comes about and how it causes suffering. And here I'd like to sort of give you a little sense of the Buddhist sense of cosmology. The Buddhism does not have a creation myth or a creation story. There's no one beginning point in time where one being decided this is how things are going to be and sets it into motion. Instead, the cosmos is kind of an ongoing process. The Buddhist once said that if you tried to find the beginning of the process, you'd never be able to do it in time. However, you can see how the process is kept going, and this is the important part about it, is how we keep this thing going. And he has what you might call the bang, bang, bang theory of the cosmos, which instead of one big bang, the world evolves, and then it devolves, and then it evolves again and devolves again, and it just goes around in these cycles. And the theory that he presents is that when the cosmos basically devolves and there's no place for beings to go, beings tend to go into two directions, one up to the formless levels, and a few really unlucky ones go to the lowest levels of hell, where they stay. And then as the cosmos begins to evolve, then the beings start penetrating the cosmos again, either from below or from above. And there's one story about how the beings coming down from above, they come from this formless level. They're reborn in this world. There's some interesting parallels with Genesis. In the beginning, the world is formless, and it's nothing but water. Okay? And the beings are self-luminous. They float around in the sky, and they're just having a good time, and they feed on rapture. And you think feeding on rapture, they'd be perfectly happy. However, as they're floating around above the water, one of them begins to notice there's this film developing on the water. And he gets curious. And out of wantonness. Now, isn't this interesting that the cosmos developed out of wantonness? Okay, he goes down, he says, "What is this?" And he takes his finger and he tastes it. This reminds me of a story I heard one time of a co-op in New York where a couple had just got a new apartment. And they looked up at the wall one time and they noticed this red sticky liquid coming down the wall from the ceiling. And they noticed this a couple days, and then there was another line and another line. They began to wonder what this was, and then the wife said, "Get me a ladder." And so she got a ladder, and she went up, and she tasted it. And it turned out it was sweet. And they discovered later that the co-op had been a sugar factory, a candy factory. And somehow some syrup was still left in the building. However, when she announced this at the co-op meeting, everybody's reaction was, "You tasted it?" So here's this. So think of this being coming down to the water, and he just sticks his finger in this film. It looks attractive, and the description is it's the color of ghee or good butter. And the taste is the taste of pure wild honey. He loves it. And so at this point, there's no he or she. It's neuter beings. At any rate, this being just starts descending on it, and craving, as the story says, craving alights and focuses on this film, which is called flavor earth. And so he descends on this and just gobbles it down. The other beings see this, and they start tasting, and they start gobbling it down too. Now what's interesting about this, as they gobble it down, they lose their self-luminosity. They can't feed on rapture anymore, they lose their own light. As they lose their own light, the sun appears, the moon appears, there's day, there's night, the seasons, the years. If you've had any experience with addiction, you can see the parallels in this story. The craving, acting on the craving, causes not only themselves to change, the world around them changes as well. If you're an alcoholic, you go into somebody's house. I'm never an alcoholic, but my brother is. And he admits that when you go into a house, you find out very quickly where the alcohol is kept in the house. It's something you're very sensitive to. Whereas if you're not an alcoholic, you wouldn't even think to ask. But that's not a part of your world. And it's the same in any state of becoming. Is it based on a desire? You begin to pick up different details in the world around you. The world changes. And you change as well. You become a different kind of person based on the desires that you follow. The Buddha has an analogy for all of this. The analogy is of a seed being planted in a field and being watered, that then grows into a state of becoming. The field here stands for karma, both past karma and present karma. Now it's important that you understand that in the Buddhist teaching, karma is not deterministic. You have the results of your actions in the past, and it's like a field full of many kind of different plants or many different potentials. And then you, as a present action or as a present intention, choose what you're interested in and what you want to develop out of those many potentials that are being offered at any one particular time. So think of your past karma as offering kind of a potential field in which you can then pick and choose what you're interested in. In some cases, this analogy, that karma is also represented as the aggregate of form, feeling, perception, fabrication, and consciousness. And these too are a type of karma, both past and present. Like your experience of your body is based to some extent on your past actions and also to some extent on how you're relating to the body right now. So karma is kind of an interaction between past and present. So that's the field. Now the seed that's being planted here is consciousness. Now consciousness is not simply a passive act of receiving impressions. It's also more active. There are certain things you're going to be interested in, certain things you're going to want to develop. But the consciousness here doesn't grow unless it's watered. And the water here is craving and clinging. The craving may be either to continue enjoying this field of karma, or if, say, good karma is being brought up by the field, you want to continue enjoying that good karma. Or if some bad karma is being brought up, you want to change it. You want to do away with it or alter it in some way. But either way, there's a craving and there's a kind of a clinging to this activity of wanting to rearrange the world all the time. This is what we do all the time. We can't leave good enough alone. We're always rearranging our experiences depending on what we like and what we don't like. And it's this craving and clinging which focus us on particular aspects of this field of potential karmas. Now the title of tonight's talk is called The Paradox of Becoming, and the paradox is this. The craving and clinging that keep the becoming going don't necessarily have to like the becoming that's being produced. They don't have to necessarily even like the field. They may actually more enjoy their present activity. Say you have a pain in your body and you get really absorbed in how to get rid of the pain. There's a craving there to get rid of the pain. There's a craving there to clinging to whatever modes you feel work. That too acts as a cause of becoming. So even though you may want to do away with a particular state of becoming, the fact that you have that craving to do away with it just creates more becoming. Now, given the fact that the processes of becoming are stressful and can cause suffering, you've got a problem. Because if you want to try to push the suffering away, you create more. If you try to push away whatever state of becoming you've created, or if you try to maintain the state of becoming, you're just creating more and more becoming. So this creates a strategic problem. And the strategic requirement, is this. Is it possible to create a state of becoming that you can just kind of be with things as they are, simply note how they're happening, and let them go, without you trying to either create more or do away with what you've got? And the Buddha's discovery was that, yes, there is. And that's the secret to his path. You're practicing a path of practice, which is to create a particular state of becoming, which then allows becoming to fall away. And in particular, right concentration is the state of becoming that he focused on. That you get the mind into a state of centered concentration, still focused not on any sensual object, and we'll get to the reason for that, but simply on the state of form or the state of formlessness, i.e. you're creating a level of becoming that's either based on the form of the body or on a formless sensation. From that position, then you can allow the process, the sort of your field of karma to produce its potentials and not get involved in them. And we'll talk about a little bit more about how that works further on. But first I'd like to point out how the issue of sensual clinging cannot exist in that particular state. It's because there really is no peace in sensual clinging. Because sensual object can arise and pass away, arise and pass away. And when, as soon as you grab for something, it's gone. So you keep grabbing again and again and again. There's a story of a young novice meditating by a river. His name is Ajiravati. And one day this prince, who is out for exercise, happens to come by the novice's hut. And the prince says, I hear you monks practice concentration of mind. You get the mind still. And Ajiravati says, yes, we do. And could you explain it to me, the prince says. And the novice says, you wouldn't understand. And the prince says, what do you mean? Give me a try at least. And Ajiravati says, okay, I'll give it a try, but if you don't understand, just leave it at that, okay? And so you get the impression this particular prince is known for being a troublemaker. So Ajiravati tries to explain how you get the mind still by focusing on the breath. And the prince says, impossible, you can't do that. And he walks away. So Ajiravati goes to see the Buddha and reports the conversation. And the Buddha says, well, how could you expect the prince to understand this? And his mind lives constantly indulging in sensual fevers, sensual passions. He's always thinking about where the next sensual fix is going to come. That kind of person cannot understand the idea that the mind could be perfectly happy to be still just with the breath. So that's a particular kind of clinging that you cannot have involved in this state of right concentration. There's another passage where after the Buddha passes away, one of the Brahmins, who's a government official, and one of the things I like about the Pali Canon is government officials are kind of dumb. And the higher up, the dumber. So this government official comes to see Ananda, and he says, "Oh, yeah, I really appreciate the Buddha. The Buddha taught concentration is a good thing. In fact, he praised all kinds of concentration." And Ananda says, "Well, that's not true. There's certain kinds of concentration he didn't praise. Concentration on anger, concentration on lust. The Buddha didn't approve of these at all. He wanted a concentration that was divorced from sensual passion." Okay. So that's going to be one of the requirements. That there are many kinds of clinging we'll go into. In fact, there are 4 altogether. But sensual clinging cannot be involved in the state of becoming that you're trying to develop here as part of the path. Okay. Turns out that right concentration was the first factor of the path that the Buddha, when he was still a young prince, discovered. You probably know the story where he went out in the forest and he was engaging in austerities. And after 6 years of austerities, you think about someone who engages in austerities, starving themselves and doing all these other horrible things. What's keeping them going? Pride. I can do this, nobody else can. Okay. That's the only way you can keep going with a particular path like that. But after 6 years, he began to realize this isn't working. And I think this is one of the more amazing parts of the Buddha's story, was he was willing to let go of his pride and say, this is not working, I've got to find something else. And so he cast around in his mind, said, could there be another path? And he remembered a time when he was a young child sitting under a tree, and his mind had entered the first jhana, or the first level of right concentration. And the question arose in his mind, could this be the path? And the response became, yes, it could. In fact, yes, it is. This is the path. So right concentration was the first factor of the path that the Buddha discovered. The other 7 factors he gradually sort of added as he continued his practice. The next question he asked himself is, okay, why am I afraid of that pleasure? Because in doing these austerities, he was constantly trying to avoid pleasure of any kind. And he said, really, there's nothing to be afraid of in that pleasure. But when the body is weak like this from starving, it cannot attain that state. So it's because of that he began to come back and eat food normally. And this explains the place of sensual pleasure in the path. I mean, you need a certain amount of sensual pleasure in order just to keep the body strong enough, i.e. you need to feed it, keep it healthy, so that the mind can gain a state of concentration. So this is one of the paradoxes of the path, is on the one hand it requires a certain amount of pleasure, but on the other hand you cannot have sensual clinging. Now, you know your mind. At one point, when you've had your second ice cream cone or your third ice cream cone, are you saying, oh, is this just pleasure or is this clinging? And there's always going to be part of the mind that says, pleasure. It's just pleasure. No problem. This is why the Buddha has people reflect on the requisites, on why you're eating. In other words, you're not supposed to be eating to fatten up the body, to put on bulk, or just to enjoy the food, but simply to keep the body alive and strong enough to practice. So in fact, that's something you should be reflecting on as you eat. At what point do you get to the point where, okay, this is enough just to keep the body going, I've got to stop. And this is an important part of the practice, is seeing that line and getting more and more sensitive to it. Ajahn Chah has an interesting test. He says, if you know that within 3 mouthfuls you're going to be full, stop. And that requires a lot of sensitivity. How much more is 3 mouthfuls? And how much more is fullness? You have to be really sensitive to that. So you do have to watch out that you're not just keep it going over the line. However, because jhana, right concentration, is a form of becoming, it also requires clinging to keep it going. It requires craving. And this is an important part to remember from tonight's talk, because many times you'll find people saying, gee, I had this wonderful state of concentration last night, but I guess if I want it back again, that's clinging and I've got to let go. No, hold on. You have to like the concentration, you have to want to do it in order to do it skillfully. And that the question of skillfulness is important here. It's not just brute desire to get the concentration, but it's learning how to focus your desire on the causes of the concentration so you can actually learn how to master it. So there is a certain amount of craving, a certain amount of clinging that's needed to keep concentration going. And in all, the Buddha delineated 4 types of clinging. First, there's sensual passion clinging, which he said is not appropriate here. But then there are 3 others which are appropriate for the purpose of the path. First is views. And we cling to views. We know often how oftentimes it's very harmful if we cling to a wrong view or a right view at the wrong time. The Buddha, however, has you develop a particular kind of right view for the path, which is looking at things in terms of where there's stress, what you're doing to cause the stress, and what you can do to stop contributing to that cause. It's just, in formal terms, this is called the Four Noble Truths. That kind of view you want to hold on to, because that's basically a view that helps you get more skillful at whatever kind of skills you're trying to develop as part of the path. You get the mind to settle down, say you're focusing on the breath. Okay, is the mind at ease with the breath? And you say, well, not really. There's still a sense of dis-ease. Okay, what's causing the dis-ease? And then you look into that. And this is applying right view to the problem of how I can get the mind to be more still, more calm, more comfortable. So you want to hold on to that view. A second part of right view is called right resolve, or sometimes it's called right intention or right aspiration. You resolve not to get involved in sensual clingings. You resolve not to think ill will of people, even though they live in undisclosed locations. And you resolve not to be harmful, not to do violence to anyone. Because you realize if you do any of these things, it's going to cause more stress and more suffering, either to yourself or to the other people. You want to avoid that. So these are the views that you hold on to in order to develop your right concentration in the right direction. Secondly, there are just clinging to habits and practices. Now, the word for habit here also means virtue or precept. You may have heard this as clinging to precepts and practices or clinging to rites and rituals. The word sila, which is often translated as virtue or precept, can also simply mean habit. I mean, they're good habits and they're bad habits. And we all know how we cling to habits. One of my favorite stories is of your inner goose. There was a story of Konrad Lorenz. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was a biologist who lived in Austria. He wrote the book on aggression. And there's one incident in the book where he talks about the story of he had a goose who laid some eggs, had some goslings, and then the mother goose died, and there's one gosling left. And so he takes on the gosling and feeds it. And of course the gosling immediately imprints on Konrad Lorenz, follows him around as if it's his mother. And so this is during the summer, and so the gosling lives outside and it grows eventually into being a goose. And as the fall comes on, Konrad Lorenz realizes that he's got to take the goose inside. Now the goose has never been in the house before. So one evening it's time for the goose to eat, and Konrad Lorenz comes home from work, and he, instead of giving the goose the food outside, he just walks into the apartment. So the goose follows him in. And the apartment is set up so that there's a hallway going down to a window at the far end, and then halfway down the hall there's a stairway going up to the right. So Konrad Lorenz goes up the stairway. Well, in the meantime, the goose is freaking out. It's never been inside a closed space before. It sees the window, goes running to the window. Realizes it can't get out, and it sees Konrad Lorenz going up the stairs, so eventually it turns around and follows Konrad Lorenz up the stairs, has its meal. Well, the next day, Konrad Lorenz opens the door, and now the goose knows enough to come inside, so goes in, walks to the window, comes back, and goes up the stairs. And with the passage of time, the walk to the window gets shorter and shorter. Until finally he goes to that side of the stairway, shakes his leg at the window, goes up the stairs. Well, there's one evening when Konrad Lorenz comes home late from work, and the goose is really hungry. So as soon as Konrad Lorenz opens the door, the goose runs in and runs up the stairs. Stops halfway up the stairs, starts shaking all over. Walks down the stairs, walks over to the window, comes back, goes up. That's clinging to habits and practices. So some of our clinging to habits and practices, we're clinging to our inner goose. But there are habits and practices that are useful to cling to for the sake of the path. And here we have right speech, right action, right livelihood. In other words, you don't speak in ways that are untruthful. You don't speak in ways that are harsh and hurtful. You don't speak in ways that divide people against each other. And finally, you don't engage in idle chatter, i.e. speech with no real intention at all. You just open your mouth and let it flap. These are good habits. Those are, if you avoid those four kinds of wrong speech, that's a good habit to develop right concentration. With right action, no killing, no stealing, no illicit sex. Right livelihood is not clearly defined, but it's essentially wrong livelihood is any livelihood which either causes harm or causes you to become dishonest. So you want to avoid those kinds of habits, the wrong speech, wrong action, wrong livelihood. And as far as practices, you want to develop the practice of jhana, i.e. the practice of right concentration, where you make a habit of trying to bring the mind to a sense of stillness. And again, there's some misunderstanding about jhana. You're not blanking out in jhana, you're developing a full body awareness. You're fully inhabiting the form of your body. So there's this full body awareness that you try to carry into as many aspects of your life as possible. Finally, there's clinging to doctrines of the self. And the Buddha never said there is no self, but he said there are ways of creating a sense of self that are skillful and ways that are unskillful. Skillful in this, for the purpose of the path, is to have a sense of responsibility, self-reliance. That you are a responsible person, you take responsibility for your actions, you learn to rely on yourself to do things more and more skillfully as you're able. There's a passage where the Buddha has you reflect every day. I am the owner of my actions. I'm the owner of my karma. Whatever I do for good or for evil, to that will I fall heir. That's a kind of there's an implicit sense of self there. And it doesn't get too clearly defined, but there is, what's important there is a sense that you're responsible for whatever happiness or suffering you're going to experience. And so you should try to act more and more skillfully all the time, i.e., employ right view to your practice of concentration, to your practice of the path, so it gets more and more skillful. Secondly, there's self-esteem. In fact, the Buddha actually uses the word conceit. He says conceit has a place on the path, in the sense that you see, other people are following the path. They're just human beings. There's nothing special about them. I'm a human being. Why can't I do this? There's a kind of conceit that goes there, but it's a healthy conceit. It's a kind of conceit, not the conceit that says, I'm already good, but says, I have the capability of learning. If you're going to be conceited about something, be conceited about your desire to learn. Those of you who have listened to Larry know that we're on the same page on this one. Okay? And finally, there's a sense of self-love that includes compassion. One of my favorite stories from the Pali Canon concerns King Basenadi and Queen Malika. They're up in their inner sanctum. And King Basenadi, in a moment of tenderness, turns to Queen Malika and he says, is there anyone you love more than yourself? Now, if this were Hollywood, you'd know her answer. And she said, yes, Your Majesty, I love you more than I love myself. And, the soundtrack would get louder and louder, drowning out any doubts to say, wait a minute, she's lying. But Queen Malika, she's not a Hollywood star. She's in the Pali Canon. She says, no. There's nobody I love more than myself. And then she turns to him, how about you? Anybody you love more than yourself? And the king has to be forced to be honest as well, no. So that's the end of that scene. The king goes down from the palace, goes and visits the Buddha, and reports what happened. And the Buddha says, that's right. That you could survey the world, and you would never find anybody that you love more than yourself. And at the same time, you never find everybody else loves themselves very fiercely. And when you reflect on that, you realize you would never want to harm anybody. Now think about that. The reason for that is people love themselves. If your happiness depends on their harm, they're not going to stand for it. So as you're planning for your happiness, if you want your happiness to be solid and true, you've got to take their happiness into consideration. So this is kind of an enlightened self-interest reason for why we have to feel compassion. And you think about it as a baby. When did you learn compassion for your mother? Not because of your innate Buddha nature. It was because you realized, if my mother's happy, I'm going to be happy. Life will be a lot easier in the house. And so that's how you learn the beginning of being sensitive to your parents' moods. Okay. So what you've got here is the practice requires a state of becoming that is built on these three kinds of clinging. Clinging to particular habits and practices, clinging to views, and also clinging to this sense of self that's responsible, has a sense of self-esteem, a sense of intelligent, enlightened self-love. In doing this, you create a state of concentration, which becomes the ideal state of becoming, for which you can then observe other states of becoming as they come and go. You'll probably realize that if you've ever tried to meditate, what do you see, say, when you're focusing on your breath? You don't just see your breath, you also see all the other thoughts coming into your mind. Now, in the beginning, your first task is to learn not to pay attention to them so you can get really focused on the breath. But once that focus gets really solid, then you can start observing these other processes. When a thought comes into the mind, how does it form? When you've got this, these incipient states of becoming coming up, how do they get created? This is why you can watch. This is how you can watch becoming as it comes up. For most of us, if you haven't practiced meditation, these states of becoming, as they come up in the mind, they're like a car that's driving up along the road. They stop in front of you and say, hey, get in, and you get in. And only when they're driving off do you ask, hey, where are we going? And who are you? Who's driving? And if we lived our lives like that, we'd have been shot in the end of some dark alley some night. But this is the way we ordinarily run with our minds. But you can get the state in a state of concentration where it's not so easily pulled into its thoughts. Then you begin to realize, okay, what's happening? This is because right concentration 1 is based on mindfulness and alertness. One of the important lessons you should learn about the Buddhist path is he never created a clear distinction between mindfulness practice and concentration practice. They're both parts of the same thing. Mindfulness starts out, as you develop mindfulness, you establish your frame of reference, and as it gets more and more solid, it turns into concentration. You've got that sense of the full body, and being fully aware of your whole body, very mindful of your whole body. And the Buddha actually says it's only in the fourth jhana, which is the point where your breath stops, that mindfulness is totally pure and totally solid. So, state of concentration is built on mindfulness and alertness. It also has a state of consistent one-pointedness, that you're focused on the one topic. Because you're focused on one topic, this is how you can observe other things as they come and go, because you've got a solid frame of a point of reference. An analogy you might want to use is of thinking lying on your back on a grassy meadow, looking up at the sky. If there's nothing on the ground that you can use as a point of reference, you don't know which direction the clouds are going. You don't even know how fast they're going. It's just this vague movement up there, and you don't really know for sure how fast they are, which direction they're going. If, however, there's a telephone pole or a tree or a house or something that you can compare it with, then you can see, oh, this one is going east and this one is going west, or how fast, or whatever. This is how you observe movements of the mind. You get the mind in one point, and whatever thoughts come in and out, you don't go with them. You've got your one point as a frame of reference, a point of reference. So this is how you can use the state of concentration to observe states of becoming as they begin to form in the mind. Ultimately, as you begin to loosen your attachment to these other states of becoming, ultimately you then start dismantling your attachment to the becoming of jhana. But in the meantime, what jhana also does is it gives you experience in manipulating the aggregates, which are the field of becoming. Because, for example, in the first jhana, you're focused on the breath, that's form. You're trying to create a feeling of ease, that's the aggregate of feeling. You use your perception of breath, 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 filling the whole body. It's the aggregate of perception. You're trying to, in the first jhana, that's what they call directed thought and evaluation, in which you keep reminding yourself to stay with the breath, and then you evaluate how the breath feels. Is it comfortable? Is it not? So that's the aggregate of fabrication. And then finally there's the consciousness, which is aware of all of this. So that's all five aggregates. That's the field of becoming. And you're learning how to master or deal with these things in a skillful way as you get the mind focused down. Secondly, there are many different levels of jhana. And as you move from one to the next, your perceptions change, or because there's less and less fabrication going on. For instance, when you go to the second jhana, that fabrication of basically talking to yourself about the breath, that gets dropped because you become one with the breath. You're kind of just planted in the breath solidly. And so you've let go of one level of fabrication. When you reach the fourth jhana, it's said that, okay, the bodily fabrication of the breath itself stops. The breath gets very still. So that you begin to see, as you get more and more focused, different levels of fabrication fall away. And so you immediately perceive the five aggregates to become no longer just concepts, that's actually something you have experience dealing with. You can see them begin to sort of separate out. John Lee gives the example of putting a rock that has different kinds of ore into a fire. When the heat reaches a certain temperature, if there's any lead in the rock, it'll come out. When it reaches another temperature, any gold in the rock will come out. Another temperature, any silver. And I don't like chemistry well enough to know which is going to melt first or not. But essentially, these begin to melt out, and you begin to see that even though they were all combined in the rock, when you reach a certain level of proficiency, they start to naturally separate out, which is what you can do in this state of jhana. Now, once you've got this state of becoming solid, this is when the Buddha has you focus more and more on what he called three perceptions. We usually call them the three characteristics. But in the Pali Canon, they're described as perceptions. This is a label that you apply to your experience. One is you look at all the potentials that could be created, that could turn into a state of becoming. Or you look into all of the states of becoming that arise. And first you see how inconstant and impermanent they are. And no matter how nice they are, they still are going to change all the time. And because it's not that they will end someday, they're constantly ending right now, and you've got to just keep shoring them up, which means that not only are they changing, they're also stressful. And because they're stressful, the question comes, do you really want to build an identity around them? It's like going into a house and knowing that the house is going to come crashing down. So the purpose of this is to attack this water of craving and clinging that keeps you creating all these new worlds, thinking that you're going to get some satisfaction out of them. Realizing, okay, it's going to come crashing down at some point.